And welcome back to Open Your Eyes. It is a lovely Wednesday morning, and it is lovely for good conversation as well. And speaking of good conversation, we're about to move on now into our first segment for the morning, and we'll be getting some updates in the sugar industry. We've got the folks in to tell us all about it. As a matter of fact, we've got in with us Andy Sutherland, who is the Director General of Foreign Trade, and William A. Neal, Communications Officer, BSI and Sugar Association of the Caribbean. Guys, good morning, and it's nice to see you. Welcome.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. Beautiful morning.
It's strange to have you on that side. That much I can tell you. And it's always nice to do an interview with you. That much I could tell you. It's always nice to have you too. So while we've broken some ice there, it is definitely one of the greatest commodities in our country, sugar. And when we talk about it, we know for a fact that it's in every household. The commodity that we've got, we know for a fact that it's top notch, but people might not be aware of what happens or how we're able to do it. How do we ship it out, or do we bring it in? Let's get to the updates on exactly what's going on with the sugar industry in our country.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, Marlene, and of course, Open Your Eyes. This has been a long process in terms of, for what we think should be an automatic process. You know, as a member state in CARICOM, you produce a particular product, you'd assume that there'd be access to the market and that you'd be able to sell your product into the region very easily. But as history would show, that has not always been the case. You know, I think Andy, as Director General of Trade, could, talk about some of the cases from the past. You know, whether you look at matches, whether you look at red kidney beans, some of the challenges that we've had. So with that kind of a backdrop, it's what we had to take into consideration when we wanted to move our sugar into the region. Of course, locally, we know that Bowen & Bowen, for example, uses the sugar that we produce in the beverages that they produce, So we had that, sorry.
And that's one of the examples
And that's one of the examples that we cited. But that did not matter, it still meant that we had quite a lot of work to do. And it started 3 years ago, actually,
So let me, I think it's important for viewers, one, to understand where we are. We need to know the backdrop, and it's a very complex issue. So what basically happened is, in steps, we lost the preferential market in Europe. And so where we were getting a really good price and they'd choose our product first, and correct me anytime I'm wrong, we lost that option, and so we had to look for other markets that we could enter into. Naturally, CARICOM, because we're a member of CARICOM, where we say, we're all brothers and sisters, we'll trade amongst each other, help to build each other together. And there's certain rules and guidelines set up as to what can come from outside of this Caribbean family. And one of the things that was coming from outside was sugar, specifically white sugar, what you call plantation white sugar. When we, Belize, approached CARICOM countries that were importing sugar, Trinidad, for example, from, let's say, Guatemala or other countries, we had problems. First of all, that the imported sugar into the Caribbean wasn't being given the tax that should be given to any product coming in. Are we good so far?
Well, there's a little technicality.
I'm trying to simplify it as much because it's a complex issue.
It is.
To understand.
Of course.
Let's start by addressing some of the statements made earlier, both by William and yourself, starting with your latest intervention about losing the preferential markets in the EU, which is not necessarily the case. Under the Economic Partnership Agreement that CARIFORUM, and Belize is a part of CARIFORUM, have signed with the EU is for duty-free quota free market access into the EU. What has changed is the preferential prices that the sugar industries of the Caribbean and the other ACP countries were receiving in the past. Now those imports into the EU are almost at world market prices, and that has created a revenue shortfall, so to speak, for BSI and other sugar producers within the region. BSI would tell you that 2018 they lost $25-35 million, although they exported 1,000 tons more. So the price is the issue. In terms of the local market, the regional market for sugar, that has to be viewed within the context of, although we're a customs union of CARICOM, and there should be duty-free trade within the single market, each countries do maintain their own, well, there's their own set of requirements for quality and food safety. And this is one of the barriers that some countries have used to exclude the products from other member states. Certainly as it relates to sugar, there's now a regional standard for brown sugar, but there isn't one that has been adopted by the region for refined sugar, and that is in the works. That should be completed following what we've completed with this latest round at COTED. As it relates to not applying the CET on sugar, you have to understand the structure of how CET, which is the rate of duty, is applied to sugar within CARICOM. Firstly, there's brown, which has a 40% CET, and SAC has alleged that certain member states have not been applying the 40%, and that issue was one of the issues we addressed at the last COTED. And for refined white is on a list called List A of the CET, which is a derogation from the 40% that is established to a lower rate that is applied by by all member states. So you'd find a situation where the sugar producers in CARICOM are applying the 40% on refined sugar, but others are applying lower rates than 40%, which is allowed by the derogated list. So you'd have Jamaica applying 25%, you'd have the smaller OECS countries applying rates as low as 5%. And some applying zero duties. So,
which makes us less competitive.
And that was one of the challenges going into creating a regional market for CARICOM sugar, is to do away with sugar on List A, removing it from List A and having the 40% applied on extra regional sugar. That is still a challenge. I must admit that we're not quite there yet. But what was agreed at the last COTED was a pathway to getting there. And
now, I think what is crucial for us to understand is we have spoken about the integration process so many times at many different levels. We talk about people being able to move, offering professional services, trade definitely as well, and we see that with the Caribbean products that come into Belize. Now, I think the assumption just always was from the public or from manufacturers that it would be fair game when we were ready and when we were creating products of the right standard to enter into the CARICOM market. Why do you think? I mean, I think I asked the representatives last time they were here if it's a matter of the idea of a single market failing countries like Belize, where we have to advocate for so long to be able to get essential products into the market.
Certainly the idea of a single market isn't a bad one.
No.
However, the CSME, if you take it as a whole, which includes the single market and the economy, it is being implemented across 5 regimes, as you've said. Goods being one, the trade in goods being one. That is the most advanced so far. Although there may be challenges that still exist. One situation is the issue with sugar. Moving from the traditional way of how a commodity is treated once that may have not met the mark in the past, or for some reason or the other it was not being traded in the region in the past. How do you shift from that mode to a mode where that product has innovated and is now ready to compete within the region? And you find that because of the derogated lists and the CET suspensions that are granted to member states, because in the past these products weren't being traded within the region.
Because we were getting better prices
exactly,
in the EU.
Right, and to transition to now a mode where these products are being produced and ready to be traded in the region, there's always a grind between countries on how to move forward with this. Sugar was a perfect example because manufacturers in the region had become accustomed to utilizing cheap dump sugar on the world market.
What do you mean by cheap dump sugar?
Well, what we did, what the William mentioned that we recently completed a substitutability study on using plantation white instead of refined. And that study found that
one, you can't do it.
Yes. Right.
And two, that in most regions you use the sugar that is available. Right. You use whatever is there. But it's a way to help the different sectors within your economy. And I think that's the challenge. When you have divergent interests, how do you bring everybody to the table and say, okay, we're a sugar producer nation as Belize, and Trinidad may be focused more on manufacturing. So how do they support Belize in this entire process? So it's having that kind of a difficult conversation and kind of bringing people to the table, but at the same time saying, listen, as a region, we have other issues that we have to look at. Food security, we can't be dependent entirely, not only for sugar, but for so many other things. We have the challenge for honey, for so many other things. I've had the opportunity to go to COTED quite a bit with Mr. Sutherland and the trade team. And you see that it is not peculiar to just sugar. It's so many other things that, chicken is another poultry, is another big issue. So there are quite a number of things that we have to look at seriously as a region. But it's how do we, have it as a win-win situation for everyone.
I like that you mentioned win-win. I think there are a lot of technicalities to what's going on here, and I think that there are a lot of people who might not understand where we're coming from with at least this commodity, at least with at least sugar. So while we've been to COTED and the conversations have been had and people are actually buying in, what do we want as a country, as a sugar producing nation right now? Because I think that's the question that's being asked right now for folks who are watching. What do we want? What are we looking for? William and Mr. Sutherland.
Yes, to get back to the original point. I need to clarify that when we mentioned about cheap dump sugar. I was referring back to the study, and what that study had revealed is that the world market for sugar is a residual market, meaning that every sugar producing country and and regions or group of countries that coexist as a regional bloc that produces sugar protects that sugar for the country and for that region. And once consumption is satisfied within those countries and regions, the residual sugar is placed on the world market at cheap prices.
So it's your leftovers.
Your leftovers. So you'd find that the world market does not reflect the cost of production in most instances, and that has been one of the grind between us and the regional manufacturers who utilizes this cheap sugar, because they don't want to relinquish that access, and that was one of the major challenge as to how do we bridge this gap and get over that hurdle.
But from the manufacturer's standpoint, I'd imagine that naturally you'd be a bit cautious of wanting to move away from what is a cheaper raw product, because then that also has implications for the cost of your value-added product when you're done. And notwithstanding the fact that naturally in business, you know, you have alliances that have been built over years and years, where Belize has never tried to access the market because we were getting really good prices in the EU. It's a big shift. So talk to me about how, I mean, clearly the manufacturers should not be controlling how the rollout of the CSME goes, but we know how things work in business.
I think a key thing, and Andy can elaborate because he's much better at the trade issues than I am, but under the CSME, what you're looking for is the access, you're looking for fairness, you're looking for so many other things, but under consideration is not price, right? So you're trying to support each other as a region, but price is not the determining factor. It should not be. Right? If something is produced in the region, you should utilize that because you have to maintain your CARICOM origin, and you get duty-free access to all the markets, right? A lot of beverages, I think they have a protection of 25% within the region, and at one time you saw, you know, so many regional beers making their way to the shores and were competitive with Belikin, right? And it's because of that access. So when you're looking at using products from outside the region because they're cheaper, but then you still want to access the regional market, then it's almost as if though you want the benefits, but you don't want to participate and be a player in the truest sense of the way. And I think it's difficult, but it's something that we have to do as a region, and it's not just for sugar; it's for everything else.
Another consideration is that SAC, of which BSI plays a leading role,
the Sugar
Association of the Caribbean, had commissioned a study in 2017 by LMC, which is a reputable commodities market researcher. And they did a study on the impact of implementing the CET on regional sugar. And that study found that if countries import, if there's a 40% CET imposed on regional imported sugar, that using CARICOM sugar, regional produced sugar, the increase in costs to manufacturers would be minimal. They hinted at 2% rise in the cost of a bottle of a 2-liter bottle of soft drink, which is about 6 cents, a 6 cents increase. But that study assumed that if the CET is applied, that the manufacturers would import the sugar and have to pay the duties, etc. But if you import from the region, that is duty-free. So even so, the cost to manufacturers would be even less because you would not be paying the duties on the extra regional or the regional imported sugar. So
with these types of studies and this kind of data available, you know, it was a very long process to kind of go through all the advocacy. We had COTED agriculture, what was it, last month or the month before?
September,
and we know that people, everyone was at the table trying to get this issue on the agenda at COTED, which you successfully did. And so while you couldn't just say, as one of the countries that's importing the sugar from outside of the Caribbean, I want the cheaper sugar, I instead said, your sugar doesn't meet my quality.
That's right.
So how did you overcome that one? And again, remember, I'm just trying to simplify it for the audience. So if I'm misrepresenting what's happening,
you're on point. That is exactly what the manufacturers have said in the past and continue to say, that when they require sugar, that it has to be of a certain polarity, 99.8 and above, and with a Ikumsa, which is the color of the sugar, of between 35 and 45 percentage points, unit points. And that is lily white sugar, which effectively excludes what we produce, and we produce a high quality plantation white sugar, and the substitutability study pointed to that Belize produce one of the highest grade plantation white within the comparator countries that were used in that study, and that included Brazil, India, Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia. All right, and we produce in par with what Brazil is producing. Wow. All right, so we produce a very high quality sugar here. But even so, the manufacturers have used the specifications to effectively block the trade of our plantation white into the region. And that is because they're saying that manufacturers have the right to choose what inputs they want to use in their own products, and they set the standards upon which that product is purchased. And in the absence of a regional standard, they set the rule. So effectively, plantation white isn't being traded within the region currently. What the decision of the COTED does was to provide, well, before I get there, the study the substitutability study had recommended that yes, plantation white can be used and is being used in industrial food manufacturing sector, including beverages, and that in most instances it is being used in the direct consumption form, but for the beverage producers you need an additional process, a clarification process that takes you to that clarity that is used, that requirement that is used within the production of beverages. And what is one of the main recommendations of that study is that investment has to be put in place either by the manufacturers, as for example what Belize's Coke bottlers do, Bowen and Bowen. They have their own clarification plant and they use plantation white and produce a simple syrup to use in their own products. Either the other manufacturers in the region does this, or this will come at a cost to them. And I think it was hinted about $1 million for the equipment to be able to get that done. Or the sugar producers could come together, invest in liquid sugar plants and supply the simple syrup to the manufacturers. Or invest in a refinery to produce refined white. And that the sugar producers and others within the region have expressed interest in moving forward with investments to meet that type of product, to be able to supply the manufacturers. And what the COTED decision does was to afford them the policy space to be able to do that, and offer them an assurance that once they have invested and are able to produce at the quantity and standards required within the region, that the CET protection would apply. And that would include the imposition of the 40%, putting these goods on the list of ineligibles, which means that a country cannot lower the duties on their own authority, but have to consult with the region to do so. And that would give the manufacturers the assurance to be able to invest and have their product be traded within the CSME.
All the advocacy work was to get this issue at the point of discussion. And I know from COTED Agriculture, the recommendations were put forward, and at the actual COTED meeting, which is the meeting of Caribbean trade ministers, talk about what happened there. This is really the major development here, to say that we have made some progress. Right.
And I think along with that, what we found out and the evidence pushed that decision was that we need to monitor the sugars coming in, because while they may be saying that we need an Ikumsa or a color of 45, we know that they were bringing in plantation white, they were bringing in brown. And the brown is of course of significant concern, because that's an erosion of the market that already exists. Under the policy, you're not to bring in brown unless you pay the CET, the full CET. So we saw that coming in, and along with all of that evidence, we were then able to say, listen, we have to halt bringing in brown, and if you bring in brown, you have to pay your full 40%. And we also need a monitoring mechanism to actually see how much sugar is coming in and what types of sugar and all of that, to make sure that we have an idea of how much sugar the region actually uses. So none of this bloated kind of playing with numbers and requirements and all of that. And so you're creating an environment that is ripe for investment. To say, as sugar producers, okay, fine, we don't produce what you need now, we're going to invest and produce what you need. But when we do, don't come back to us saying, oh, it's not, quite what we want, and move the goalposts again.
Wow.
Now, this was, while we've been discussing it locally here, it does not only affect Belize. We had Mr. James from the Sugar Association Caribbean. He spoke for Jamaica and also for the other producers. Which other countries in the Caribbean are being affected by this?
Well, certainly Guyana as one of the other major sugar producing states, so thus far. Jamaica, to some extent, they do produce sugar, mostly to fuel their rum industry. Barbados does the same. They produce sugar to fuel their fuel Mount Gabe's production. Very fine rum.
Clearly one of your favorites.
So currently there are at least 4 member states within CARICOM that have ongoing sugar production facilities, and clearly Belize is in the lead because we have invested heavily in both plantation and plant, and are producing direct consumption sugars for not only for the local market but for exports, and we're the only one producing plantation white thus far. So the rest, Guyana has some catch up to do. However, they have marshaled some resources and are gearing towards producing refined sugar in the near future. So our own sugar producers has to be able to keep pace,
so we'll have
after this long flight. After this long flight, we don't get displaced in the market by our own sister country inside.
And that's what I wanted to clarify too, because it's not just Belize that wanted to be able to have this access. Other countries as well also wanted access, but also this doesn't mean that there's a shipment going out tomorrow to other Caribbean countries.
It's going to take at least another year and a half or so of production and preparation, actually. And of course, because we've had the drought, there are certain challenges that we still face, no? But we're in a position where we're making the investments, and we want to make sure that when we have the sugar, that the market will then, and the other member states will support. And that's the key thing. I think what I have to say here is this was a perfect example of synergy between public and private sector. On the private side, both BSI and Santander as members, sugar producers collaborated with government, and that meant agriculture and also trade in terms of doing the advocacy work that was necessary. So it's very, very significant in terms of what this means and what it signals in terms of the collaboration that is necessary if you're going to move any product into the region.
Now, I guess for me, the most critical question is, what does this mean for farmers and for our local economy? The last SIB statistics clearly show you're exporting far more than you used to, but earning far less. And we're not talking about being able to access Caribbean markets tomorrow or next year. What is going to happen in the interim? Because we have the lingering issues of the drought, and we still have to be able to sustain the industry in this time that it will take to catch up.
It's obviously a very difficult time for sugar and for the agricultural sector across the board, and that has a ripple effect, a direct effect on the overall economy of the country. So you've seen government talking about support and sourcing funds through CDB and other sources. You have to put in the mitigation strategies that are necessary to shore up your own production. And in the north, that's exactly what we're doing. Fortunately, sugar is a cyclical kind of business, and what has been happening globally is we're not the only ones who are suffering from a drought. So you're going to see a fall off in production in terms of sugar, which could then mean that the prices will go up because it's cyclical. So it's not a situation where we're in isolation and this is unique only to Belize. You're looking at a global commodity, and so the effect is going to be global. But you also have to, on a local level, make sure that you have the policies and the kind of interventions in place. So we're also trying to secure funds from the Green Climate Fund to look at how we can increase our production or at least stabilize production. You know, whether that's looking at water management, whether, you know, whatever strategies you need to put in place. And it's also means that you have to educate farmers, you have to minimize things like even pests during a time like this. There's so many moving parts, but you have to continue working diligently, and that's why it's important that there's no politicking around this particular issue, but you actually support the agricultural sector because you see how significant it is to the economy as a whole.
Definitely.
But I mean, and that really I think is one of the things that quite a number of the or the agricultural sector in general has to look at, the effects of climate change. But then sugar has the additional obstacle of finding markets. And my question is, so we've worked so hard to try to get, you know, the door open for CARICOM, but are you also looking to diversify your market? Because we also, I mean, it is an important sector for us, and without having, it's what we did. We put all our eggs in the basket with the European Union, and then when that no longer was available to us, now shifting the eggs to the Caribbean market. Are we exploring other markets, and are we able to access others?
Yes, very pertinent question. We're not only just back from COTED, but we're back from Taiwan.
Okay.
And we have successfully negotiated an economic cooperation agreement with Taiwan, and central to that agreement is sugar. So we have secured duty-free access into Taiwan for sugar, for a certain quota of sugar. And that quota would be split between browned and refined, so you'd have a market for both. That agreement, while we've concluded it at the technical level, it is now with the said COTED because it's a treaty obligation that you have to submit these agreements to the COTED, because we're a single market, for them to approve what was negotiated. What we've seen so far, and we expect to have a special meeting of the COTED by video conference next week, but what we've seen so far is not too much opposition to what we've negotiated, and once that is through the doors at COTED, we'll be clear to sign that agreement with Taiwan. Once we've signed it, it goes for ratification by the Senate. And on Belize's side, we would have completed the legal requirements to put that agreement into force. On the Taiwan side, they go into elections January 2020, and their process won't be completed until after that. So I'm thinking about mid-2020, the sugar industries in Belize would have an additional market in Taiwan for them to explore the possibilities of trade.
All right. Well, thank you for coming in and providing the latest update.
Very educational.
And we do appreciate taking the time to explain it as best as possible to viewers, and so that we know where this all started and where we are now. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, very important conversation as we sit down with representatives from Crime Stoppers Belize, and they're making it even easier for you to submit tips about crimes that you know information about. So please stay tuned.